you very much, Rolando. So this is indeed an exciting day, beginning this series of very important and I think going to be very stimulating discussions around Lenin. We are here obviously to celebrate Lenin, but also I hope in a non-religious manner, to also to disagree about Lenin, to contest aspects of Lenin's thought, and to try and build on them in as productive a way as possible for the 21st century. So I can't think of anyone more suitable to kick off that series of events than Paul Leblanc. Paul Leblanc is a comrade born in 1947, based in Pittsburgh in the US, who has been all of his life an activist. He was active in the 1960s in the New Left in the US, in Students for a Democratic Society. He was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement. He has been active around a whole series of struggles around anti-racist and feminist struggles, and also solidarity, internationalist and solidarity movements with Central America and Latin America. And he has been a member of a number of different socialist organizations in the US throughout his adult life. But Paul is also, as well as being an activist, a scholar, an indefatigable and prolific scholar. He's the author, I believe, of over 30 books, which is extremely impressive, focusing, I would say, probably around three major topics. One, working class formation, struggles, and political parties in the United States. The second, around the work of a number of important revolutionaries, most significantly Rosa Luxemburg and Leon Trotsky. And thirdly, and that's of course the reason why he is speaking today at this inaugural event, on Lenin himself. I think many people will have come across Paul's work first with his major book, Lenin and the Revolutionary Party, which was published originally in 1990. Not a good time in general to be publishing something positive about Lenin. And I think it's fair to say that that book was inaugurated itself what now is quite a substantial literature of left revisionist discussions about Lenin that kick back both against Cold War denigrations of Lenin, and of course against also Stalinist hagiographies of Lenin. And Paul has continued since then to write and publish on Lenin, to edit volumes of Lenin's texts, and most recently he has just published a book with Pluto Press called Lenin Responding to Catastrophe, Forging Revolution. So yes, I can't think of anyone more suitable to begin this series of events, and so that's why I'm going to hand the floor right over to Paul for his inaugural lecture.
So it's a pleasure to be here with you, comrades. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and now I will begin. In the 100th anniversary year of Lenin's death, the importance of engaging with the ideas and work of this uncompromising revolutionary flows not only from our need to comprehend the past, but also the present and possibilities of the future. The agenda of this presentation is quite ambitious. The overarching theme involves the democratic qualities and continuing relevance of Lenin's orientation. Within that framework, we will touch first on why Lenin has been seen so negatively and so often, and then sketch his actual political and organizational views, briefly tracing how this played out in the Russian Revolution of 1917. And there are little notes flashing on my screen that are distracting me, but I will soldier on here. So in our remaining time, we will touch on complications of all of this, and particularly in regard to applying Lenin's ideas to our own time. So this talk is organized into 5 parts. Part 1, critics and distortions. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known by his revolutionary alias, Lenin, is a central figure in the history of the 20th century. In support of this view, one relevant set of facts involves his role as a leader of the 1917 Russian Revolution and a founder of the modern communist movement. Another set of facts involves how he has been perceived by millions of people, for some as evil incarnate, and for others as a benevolent genius. A third factual cluster involves his development of Marxism's revolutionary cutting edge, which has relevance for the future. Contrary to the notions of critics and even partisans, I will argue that Lenin's understanding of socialism and of methods necessary in the struggle for it are profoundly democratic, in harmony with the perspectives of such revolutionary and democratic-minded socialists as Karl Marx and Rosa Luxemburg. His legacy continues to have relevance, especially for activists in our own catastrophic time. But why have so many flocked to reject Lenin? In part, because he is a revolutionary exemplar, perceived as an outstanding example for those who would like to see a socialist revolution. There are some, however, who, for a variety of reasons, embrace the status quo and do not take kindly to those like Lenin who threaten to disrupt it. Over the years, we have also seen revolutionaries becoming disillusioned with socialist revolution's possibility. In some cases, one-time adherents, out of weariness or frustration, feel a need to draw back from the struggle. And there are yet others who would like to see a better world, but who are not inclined to subject themselves to the incredible stresses connected with efforts to actually overturn capitalism. Some of these people are therefore moved to explicitly reject the revolutionary exemplar. More than this, a great many people have a false understanding of Leninism as elitist, manipulative, and authoritarian that has been spread far and wide both by critics and partisans of Lenin. There are peculiar similarities in the way Lenin is perceived both by some anti-Leninists and by some who claim to be Leninists. It is worth spending a moment on this. The variety of critical viewpoints regarding Lenin can be illustrated through the evolution from communism to anti-communism of a very influential interpreter of Leninist thought named Bertram D. Wolfe. He was a pro-Lenin enthusiast for a quarter of a century, first as a leading figure of the US Communist Party, then in a dissident communist group, which sought acceptance back into the mainstream of the pro-Stalin communist movement. And none of this worked out in the way that he hoped. As a disillusioned ex-communist, he initially developed a nuanced critique in which Lenin's conscious commitment to democracy was subverted by some of his own undemocratic assumptions and impulses. Later, as an employee of the US State Department during the Cold War, Wolfe ended up simply denouncing Lenin as a cynical architect of totalitarianism, who, similar to Adolf Hitler, should never have been born. There are varieties of Lenin partisans as well. The most powerful were Joseph Stalin and his co-thinkers, who adhered to an incredibly stilted, narrow, undemocratic understanding of Lenin's thought and practice. They used their version of Leninism to justify policies and practices which they wanted to implement in the 1920s, the 1930s, and beyond. Because Stalin was at the pinnacle of state power in the Soviet Union and was a prime influence in the world communist movement for about a quarter of a century, he had the ability to destroy communists who opposed him, and also had the authority and resources to widely propagate his own particular understanding of Leninism. Given the prevalence of this authoritarian understanding of Lenin, it is little wonder that many millions of people are inclined to accept such an interpretation as representing the truth. In contrast to this, a growing number of serious scholars and thoughtful activists have been finding in Lenin's actual thought and practice qualities which are far more interesting, valuable, and democratic than is commonly thought. Part 2, Revolutionary Democratic Program. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels link the working class winning the battle for democracy with a society moving forward to the creation of socialism, a society of the free and the equal. For Lenin, the struggles for democracy and for socialism were similarly inseparable. When he was first presenting the case for Russia's rising layer of Marxist revolutionaries in the 1890s, Lenin called for a growing and militant socialist party that would lead struggles of the working class in Russia around two interrelated focal points, socialism and democracy. Or as he put it in 1897, the Russian Social Democrats have always emphasized the dual manifestation and content of the class struggle of the proletariat, and they have always insisted on the inseparable connection between their socialist and democratic tasks. The socialist task was defined as the fight against the capitalist class, aimed at destroying the class system and organizing socialist society. The democratic task was defined as the fight against Tsarist absolutism, aimed at winning political liberty in Russia and democratizing the political and social system of Russia. He went on to explain that the proletariat alone can be, and because of its class position, must be a consistently democratic, determined enemy of absolutism, incapable of making any concessions or compromises. The proletariat alone can be the vanguard fighter for political liberty and for democratic institutions. There were, he argued, two reasons for this. First, political tyranny bears most heavily upon the proletariat, whose position gives it no opportunity to secure a modification of that tyranny. It has no access to the higher authorities, not even to the officials, and it has no influence on public opinion. Second, the proletariat alone is capable of bringing about the complete democratization of the political and social system, since this would place the system in the hands of the workers. By the way, much of the wording here is from Lenin's actual writings. There's lots of quotations, so many quotations in this presentation that in a way, Lenin is kind of a co-author. We're co-authors of this, but in any event, be aware that a lot of this is simply quotations from Lenin. In 1899, Lenin was elaborating on the same points. The essence of the Russian Marxist program, he explained, was to organize the class struggle of the proletariat and to lead this struggle, the ultimate aim of which is the conquest of political power by the proletariat and the establishment of a socialist society. He went on to clarify that this involved the economic struggle against individual capitalists or against individual groups of capitalists for the improvement of the workers' condition, and the political struggle against the government for the broadening of the people's rights, i.e., for democracy, and for the broadening of the political power of the proletariat. In 1903, the Russian Marxists broke into two contending factions, Lenin's militant Bolsheviks and the more moderate Mensheviks. But 1 year earlier, in his classic What Is to Be Done, Lenin underscored the agreed-upon notion of the need to expound and emphasize general democratic tasks before the whole people, without for a moment concealing our socialist convictions. In a key passage, he asserted that a Marxist must function as the tribune of the people, who is able to react to every manifestation of tyranny and oppression, no matter where it appears, no matter what stratum or class of the people it affects. He who is able to generalize all these manifestations and produce a single picture of police violence and capitalist exploitation, who is able to take advantage of every event, however small, in order to set forth before all his socialist convictions and his democratic demands, in order to clarify for all and everyone the world historic significance of the struggle for the emancipation of the proletariat. Another classic work was Lenin's polemic in the midst of the revolutionary upsurge of 1905, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution. Here, he argued for a militant worker-peasant alliance to overthrow Tsarism, rejecting the worker-capitalist alliance advocated by his Menshevik comrades. He expressed the view of both factions, however, that whoever wants to reach socialism by a different road other than that of political democracy will inevitably arrive at conclusions that are absurd and reactionary, both in the economic and the political sense. He noted that the slogan of a democratic republic is necessary both as a matter of logic and in point of principle, for it is precisely complete freedom that the proletariat, as the foremost champion of democracy, is striving to attain. One more quick aside. Once a young comrade complimented me on an interesting talk, but wondered what the word proletariat meant. And so, of course, a number of us know when I say proletariat, when Lenin says proletariat, they're talking about the working class. Lenin was forever pointing out the hypocrisy and falseness of the so-called democracy and freedom represented by pro-capitalist liberals, because capitalism's inherent inequality of wealth and power always stacks the deck against the laboring majority. As against this, Lenin's Bolsheviks insisted on the fullest possible measure of political liberty, both from the standpoint of the immediate interests of the proletariat and from the standpoint of the final aims of socialism. Genuine freedom and democracy are inherently anti-capitalist and revolutionary. In the midst of the First World War, the nature and role of democracy was a key question animating Lenin's thinking, and by 1916 he had arrived at a very clear and definite view of the relationship between economics and politics in the epoch of struggle for socialism. This is the judgment of his close comrade Nadezhda Krupskaya in her Reminiscences of Lenin. Stressing that the role of democracy in the struggle for socialism could not be ignored, Krupskaya quotes Lenin as insisting that democracy is necessary for the achievement of socialism in two respects. First, the working class cannot carry out a socialist revolution unless it is prepared for that through struggles for democracy. And second, socialism cannot maintain its victory and bring humanity to the time when the state will wither away unless democracy is fully achieved. Regarding Lenin's conception of socialism and some of the ideas expressed here, I want to bring your attention to the fact that in a few days, on February 1st, there is going to be a Leninist Days panel with Tomas Krausch and myself, looking specifically at Lenin's conception of socialism. Lenin's linkage of the socialist goal with the withering away of the state is grounded in Marx's critique of the Gotha program. Lenin sees the achievement of the goal of a stateless socialism evolving over time as democracy becomes a habit in the way people function as decision makers. But he also sees the existence of genuine democracy as an essential element in a political strategy that will replace capitalism with socialism. Details of that strategic orientation are suggested in this lengthy quotation from The Revolutionary Proletariat and the Right of Nations to Self-Determination, written in 1915. We must combine the revolutionary struggle against capitalism with a revolutionary program and tactics in respect of all democratic demands, including a republic, a militia, election of government officials by the people, equal rights for women, self-determination of nations, etc. So long as capitalism exists, all these demands are capable of realization only as an exception and in incomplete, distorted form. Basing ourselves on democracy as already achieved and showing up its deficiency under capitalism, we demand the overthrow of capitalism and the expropriation of the bourgeoisie as an essential basis both for abolishing the poverty of the masses and for fully and thoroughly implementing all democratic transformations. Some of those transformations will be started before the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, others in the course of this overthrow, and still others after it. The social revolution is not a single battle, but an epoch of a series of battles on all and every problem of economic and democratic transformations, whose completion will be effected only with the expropriation of the bourgeoisie. It is for the sake of this ultimate goal that we must formulate every one of our democratic demands in a consistently revolutionary manner. Part 3, Democratic Revolutionary Organization. We can see the profoundly democratic aspirations guiding Lenin's organization, which flowed into helping to make the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Before examining the democratic dynamics of that revolutionary overturn, it would make sense to touch on democratic dynamics within the organization itself. We will then conclude by touching on several problematical points relating to using Lenin's orientation within our own reality. In the early 1900s, Lenin held up for Russian revolutionaries the ideal of Germany's massive Social Democratic Party, the SPD, then the largest socialist workers' party in the world. Perceiving it as an outstanding example of working-class democracy, he extolled the SPD's practice of developing revolutionary cadres, rooted in the advanced layer of the working class. Such a working-class activist was trained in multifaceted skills. He acquires experience and dexterity in his revolutionary profession. Lenin commented, adding, he broadens his outlook and increases his knowledge. He observes at close quarters the prominent political leaders from other localities and of other parties. He strives to rise to their level and combine in himself the knowledge of the working class environment and the freshness of socialist convictions with professional skill. Lenin hoped that ever-increasing numbers of working class comrades would develop in this way. He concluded that without this, the proletariat cannot wage a stubborn struggle against its excellently trained enemies. Lenin stressed the difference between the very repressive conditions of Tsarist Russia and the freer conditions existing in European countries to the West. Not inclined to indulge in what he termed a toy democracy that could get everyone arrested, Lenin insisted the Russian organization must maintain secure underground practices to protect the working class revolutionary so that he may go underground in good time when necessary. While emphasizing the fine art of not getting arrested, he projected the development of a network of an increasing number of talented agitators, but also talented organizers, propagandists, and practical workers in the best sense of the term, intimately connected with the spontaneous rise of a mass workers' movement that becomes broader and deeper. Lenin envisioned the Revolutionary Party as a close and compact body of comrades, in which all are infused with a lively sense of their responsibility. The forces of specially trained worker revolutionaries who have gone through extensive preparation, Lenin believed, boundlessly devoted to the revolution, will enjoy the boundless confidence of the widest masses of the workers. As 1905 began to blend into 1906, an influential concept of democratic centralism became prevalent within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. All factions, Mensheviks as well as Bolsheviks, favored democratic decision-making and democratic elections within all party organizations, with the understanding that decisions of the guiding organizations are binding on those members of those organizations of which the collective is an organ. And decisions of lower-level organizations are not to be implemented if they contradict decisions of higher organizations. The Bolsheviks emphasized that while granting elected centers full powers in matters of ideological and practical leadership, they are at the same time subject to recall by the membership. Their actions are given wide publicity, and they are to be strictly accountable for these activities. Critics commonly describe democratic centralism as a Leninist mechanism far more centralist than democratic, requiring on the one hand a strong leader, and on the other hand a rank-and-file membership consciously and joyfully submitting to the leadership imposed on it by senior members, as Cold War scholar Alfred G. Meyer once put it. Indeed, the Stalinist variant of Leninism asserted that it was developed to ensure complete inner unity of outlook, according to J. Peters in his 1935 pamphlet, The Communist Party, A Manual on Organization. But this is not how the term was understood by Russian revolutionaries of 1917. Lenin himself insisted the health of the revolutionary organization required that the ideological struggle in the party on the question of theory and tactics be conducted as openly, widely, and freely as possible, just so long as this not disturb or hamper the unity of revolutionary action. He also underscored the necessity for the rights of all minorities and for all loyal opposition, as well as the relative autonomy of local organizations. He summarized democratic centralism as freedom of discussion, unity of action. The highest decision-making body in the party was not a party dictator or central committee or political committee, but rather the party congress or convention. The central committee was elected by and answerable to the party congress. The Congress was to be held every year or two, consisting of elected delegates from every local branch of the party. These elections were to take place after a period of written and oral discussion and debate on the issues facing the party. It was the decisions of such a Congress that were considered binding on the lower level organizations, on the leadership, and on the membership. Lenin always, as long as he lived, attached tremendous importance to party congresses, recalled Krupskaya. He held the party congress to be the highest authority, where all things personal had to be cast aside, where nothing was to be concealed, where everything was open and above board. A growing number of scholars have found, as Ronald Sunni puts it, that the Bolsheviks operated not as a tightly centralized party in which orders that came down from above were faithfully carried out without question, but as a loose and disputatious collection of strong-willed activists who had to be persuaded of the right course to take. They were an argumentative lot. They were Protestants without an infallible pope. Many were well read in the classics of Marxism and kept abreast of the controversies at party congresses and in the party press, who were dedicated to using a body of political theory and historical interpretation to analyze the politics of the moment and predict possible outcomes. Strategy followed from their reading of the class configuration in Russia and in Europe. Part 4, Making Sense of Russia's Revolution. How did this play out in Russia's revolutions of 1917, both the February-March overthrow of the Tsar and the October-November replacement of the provisional government by all power to the Soviets? The 1917 reports from knowledgeable New York Tribune foreign correspondent Isaac Don Levine give a sense of the revolutionary dynamics. While the mainstream politicians in the rather lame Tsarist parliament, the Duma, reared back in fear, an upsurge in late February challenged the power of the Tsar, demanding peace, bread, land, liberty. According to Levine, the leaders of the socialistic, revolutionary, and labor elements organized for a general attack against the old regime, forming democratic activist councils, Soviets. Levine tells us they mobilized a revolutionary army composed of soldiers, armed students, and workers. Red flags were now waving in the air everywhere, and singing the songs of freedom and revolution. The masses continued their victorious fight. The Tsarist autocracy collapsed. The revolution was triumphant. Traditional liberal and conservative politicians, with support from moderate socialists, hastily composed a provisional government, but its power was limited. It was the workers and soldiers that actually fought and shed their blood for the freedom of Russia, Levine reported at the time. The Duma, from which the provisional government arose, took a hand in the situation only after the revolution had achieved its main success. The gulf between the provisional government and the Council of Deputies, that is, the Soviets, is as wide as between the United States government and socialism, Levine explained to his readers. Only such an upheaval as the revolution could have bridged this chasm between the two extremes. While the provisional government represents business and commerce, he noted, the ultimate aim of the Workers' Council is social revolution. To achieve this revolution, it is necessary to dethrone the political autocrats first, they say. Then the capitalistic system must be attacked by the working classes of all nations as their common enemy. This account from Levine was in June 1917. A tumultuous swirl of events swept through Russia from June to October, with Lenin and the Bolsheviks demanding, down with the provisional government, all power to the Soviets. By October, the Bolsheviks and their allies had won substantial majorities in key Soviets, and the Soviets they led went on to depose the provisional government. The morning after the seizure of power, Lenin, speaking for the new revolutionary government, proclaimed, "Comrades, working people, remember that now you yourselves are at the helm of state. No one will help you if you yourselves do not unite and take into your hands all affairs of the state. Your Soviets are from now on the organs of state authority, legislative bodies with full powers." This ultra-democratic vision incorporated an explicit commitment to move forward to socialism in Russia and globally. He concluded, gradually, with the consent and approval of the majority of the peasants, in keeping with their practical experience and that of the workers, we shall go forward firmly and unswervingly to the victory of socialism, a victory that will be sealed by the advanced workers of the most civilized countries, bring the people lasting peace, and liberate them from all oppression and exploitation. I want to add here, this is not simply revolutionary rhetoric. Lenin was serious about every word that he's saying in this declaration. And Lenin's final point in this statement indicates the central importance of revolutionary internationalism, what some have called solidarity across borders, for the Russian Revolution and for revolutionary strategy altogether. This is why Lenin and his comrades formed the Communist International, to help build up effective revolutionary parties throughout the world. As he explained in 1918 in his letter to American workers, we are banking on the inevitability of the world revolution, adding, we are now, as it were, in a besieged fortress, waiting for the other detachments of the world socialist revolution to come to our relief. Rosa Luxemburg also noted that the whole calculation behind the Russian fight for freedom is based on the tacit presumption that the revolution in Russia ought to become the signal for the revolutionary rising of the proletariat in the West. And if that failed to happen, even the greatest energy and the greatest sacrifices of the proletariat in a single country must inevitably become tangled in a maze of contradiction and blunders. Making common cause with Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the final weeks before she was killed, Luxemburg helped establish the German Communist Party and labored to help make a socialist revolution in Germany. At the same time, she was increasingly critical of what she saw as the contradictions and blunders that moved developments in Soviet Russia away from the workers' democracy that she, Marx, and Lenin had always stood for, veering instead in the direction of the one-party dictatorship and bureaucratic tyranny that would become consolidated in future years under the Stalin regime. Luxemburg noted that such developments were taking place under conditions of bitter compulsion and exigency amid the swirling maelstrom of events. This maelstrom of events included the incredible violence of immensely powerful global forces, prepared to destroy the revolution through economic strangulation, with consequent waves of famine and disease, military intervention, invasion, and the generous funding of counter-revolutionary forces in a brutal civil war. Hostile capitalist governments also labored to create, around revolutionary Russia, a cordon sanitaire, a chain of anti-revolutionary dictatorships that would prevent the spread of revolution and cause the Soviet Republic to fester and finally die in its isolation. Lenin and the Bolsheviks resorted to extreme authoritarian measures, the Red Terror, and a dictatorship not of the workers and peasants, but of a beleaguered and increasingly dictatorial Russian Communist Party. This was not meant to be some new pathway to build socialism, but simply a desperate effort to survive until socialist revolutions spread to more countries that would join with Soviet Russia to build a better world. Luxemburg knew the revolution's leaders and felt there could be no doubt that it has only been with the greatest internal misgivings and extreme inner reluctance that the gifted leaders at the vanguard of the Russian Revolution, i.e. Lenin and Trotsky, have taken certain decisive steps on the thorny path they navigate, with snares of all kinds on either side. Luxemburg's sharp critique of the Russian Revolution was designed to strengthen the global struggle for socialism in order, as she put it, to distinguish the essential from the non-essential, the kernel from the accidental excrescences in the politics of the Bolsheviks. In order to help advance socialist revolution throughout the world, she believed, the positive essentials of Lenin's approach, which have been the focus of this presentation, must be separated from the non-essentials associated with the authoritarian swerve taken by Lenin and his comrades in the desperate years following 1917. Due to the failure of the revolutionaries, Luxemburg as much as Lenin, Russia's revolutionary regime remained isolated in a hostile capitalist world, and the result was the eventual consolidation after Lenin's death of the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin. The non-essential qualities that Luxemburg critiqued became essentials of Stalinism. Lenin himself, from his youth to his death, sought to remain true to the original essentials. It is worth noting that one element of this was his approach to revolutionary theory. Lenin insisted that Marxism is not a dogma, but a guide to action. He saw the relationship between theory and practice, between Marxist thought and practical political activity, as a complex interplay. He insisted that genuinely revolutionary theory assumes final shape only in connection with the practical activity of a truly mass and truly revolutionary movement. He sought to explain to comrades of other countries that the history of Bolshevism could not be understood in a simplistic way. It must include a variety of qualities: adherence to basic revolutionary conceptions combined with the struggle for more modest reforms, knowing the difference between revolutionary practice and revolutionary phrasemongering, the interplay of democracy and class consciousness, being able to push forward against opponents on the left, flexibility to compromise and to form a united front, knowing when to attack and when to retreat, always learning from experience. While the revolution might not be about to break out in one or another particular country, Lenin argued, every struggle for the most limited immediate demand is a source of revolutionary education, for it is the experiences of struggle that will convince working people of the inevitability of revolution and the significance of communism. Part 5, Lenin's reality and our reality. Flexibility was a key to Lenin's orientation. History as a whole, and the history of revolutions in particular, Lenin emphasized, is always richer in content, more varied, more multiform, more lively and ingenious than is imagined by even the best parties, the most class-conscious vanguards of the most advanced classes. An effective communist international, he insisted, can never be built up on stereotyped, mechanically equated, and identical tactical rules of struggle. Lenin urged comrades of different countries to seek out, investigate, predict, and grasp what is nationally specific and nationally distinctive, to correctly adapt and apply revolutionary perspectives to their specific contexts. He rejected as stupid the notion that the Communist International would ever call upon revolutionaries of other lands slavishly to imitate the Russians. He commented to his Italian comrades, "The revolution in Italy will run a different course than that in Russia. How? Neither you nor we know. One must be open to a variety of possibilities." This brings us to the next to last point of this presentation. Lenin's actual ideas and practice developed and made sense within a specific context which no longer exists. While we live in a very different world than he did, however, it is not a totally different world. In the hopeful struggles and horrific experiences of the 20th century, global mass movements of the workers and oppressed were ultimately defeated and largely destroyed. Capitalism remains the most dynamic economic system in human history, and so it has continued to evolve in amazing ways, evolving in the face of immense challenges and through seemingly overwhelming crises brought on by its own contradictions. The inevitable proliferation of new technologies and techniques, the voraciously expansive reach developing within industrial capitalist society, and the amazing processes of globalization have transformed capitalism in multiple ways. But the need for profit-driven business enterprise to exploit humanity's life and labor has remained the same. More and more aspects of our lives have been invaded and battered through the capital accumulation process. Through this, The old working class has been largely overwhelmed, and much of it even obliterated. Yet through capitalism's continued dynamic development, more and more people within sectors of our planet's labor market are proletarianized, dominated, exploited, oppressed, and endangered. The structure of and dynamics of the global economy generate deepening inequalities, instabilities, and destructiveness that throw into question the future of human civilization and even humanity's ability to survive. An eroding quality of life for more and more of the world's laboring majorities is matched by growing authoritarianism, irrationality, and violence across the face of our planet. A voracious market economy designed to enrich already immensely wealthy elites is intimately connected with the environmental destruction engulfing our world. By the way, on February 29th, a Leninist Days panel with Jody Dean, Kai Heron, and myself will focus on such things as the contemporary relevance and especially what has been labeled climate Leninism. Today's presentation will conclude with a further consideration of this matter of environmental destruction. But first, it makes sense to reemphasize more strongly a fundamental difference between Lenin's time and ours. Much of what Lenin had to say and tried to do made sense within a global political context that no longer exists. In his time, socialist and labor parties, with massive working class constituencies, profoundly influenced by Marxist theory and explicitly committed to replacing capitalism with socialism, were the largest political parties within each of the major European nations. Angelika Balabanov later recalled the mighty Socialist International on the eve of World War I, embracing millions of men and women in every nation of the world, including the most advanced and articulate workers, the most influential leaders of labor, many of the ablest journalists and foremost intellectuals of the day. A bulwark of working class consciousness and socialist commitment. Its leaders sat in parliaments and trade union councils, and its hundreds of newspapers were daily fare of the European masses, animated by a common faith. Today, this movement exists as shreds and tatters and faded residues in much of the world where it was once vibrant and powerful. A primary task of those who would be guided by the perspectives of such people as Marx and Luxemburg and Lenin will have to involve rebuilding something approximating this massive political, cultural, social force for socialism. The socialist movement of the late 19th century was created in an era of expansive and surging capitalism. Of course, the revitalization of the revolutionary socialist component of that movement, under the banner of communism in the early 20th century, took place within a context of capitalist crisis and horrific catastrophe of imperialist war. The revolutionaries, such as Lenin, had the advantage, however, of building on recent socialist achievements. Still, Lenin understood that they would need to build up their movement within and in contraposition to a catastrophic world war. Our own daunting task of recreating a global mass socialist movement will have to occur in an era of catastrophe even more horrific than the mass slaughter of World War I. The destabilization and unraveling of the global environment, and a consequent wave of economic calamities and mass fatalities. In this, we are cursed by good fortune turning to bad fortune. Fortunately, a scientific consensus projects that climate change, currently being driven by the immensely powerful fossil fuel industries, might still be halted, preventing our planet from being overwhelmed by cascading catastrophes. This will require dramatic, decisive, immediate action on a global scale. Unfortunately, the necessary changes will be too costly in the short run for the businesses and governments that make the decisions. So far, the necessary changes are being implemented. Liberal politicians offer reassuring rhetoric and phony compromises and inadequate policies. Fake populists on the extreme right deny the realities of climate change altogether, resorting to authoritarian, bigoted, and violent policies in response to ominous problems threatening our world. As increasing millions of the world's people are impacted by the cascading catastrophes, a mass disillusionment with the capitalist status quo is likely, with a deepening radicalization. In contrast to Lenin's time, we lack the mass labor and socialist movements in most countries where they existed in the early 20th century. We must create the mass movements we need, more or less from scratch. But how? Some analysts have urged what they call a Green New Deal, and there are different names for this in different parts of the world, but in the United States it's called the Green New Deal. In tackling the climate crisis, we can create hundreds of millions of good jobs around the world, invest in the most systematically excluded communities and nations, guarantee health care and child care, and much more. So says social critic Naomi Klein. She adds, the result of these transformations would be economies built both to protect and regenerate the planet's life support systems, and to respect and sustain the people who depend on them. This transitional approach combines multiple goals: people before profit, decent homes and good communities for all, healthcare for all, education for all, mass transit and communication systems for all, nourishing food, access to cultural and recreational nourishment, creative outlets, genuine liberty, and real justice for all. Stemming from today's conditions and from the consciousness of expanding layers of youth and the experiences of the laboring majority, it may be possible to build a fundamental challenge to the existing system of power and to create a better world. As we strive to advance that process, there is much to learn from the ideas, the insights, and the experiences of freedom fighters who went before. Lenin, with all of his accomplishments and insights, all of his mistakes and heroic efforts, is among the freedom fighters we should look to. During this anniversary, as the conference poster puts it, of 100 years without Lenin and 100 years with Lenin, there is a swelling flood of books, articles, interviews, and events, including this 4-month extravaganza of Leninist days. The many, many thousands of words and ideas flowing from all of this will, throughout the remainder of 2024 and into the next several years, be blending with increasingly challenging experiences, some of which promise to be truly catastrophic. It is inevitable that more and more masses of people around the world will be wrestling with the old question, what is to be done? It is likely that at least elements of the answer will emerge from our engagement with these Leninist days. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for that excellent talk. Yes, as Rolando says, Paul's talk will be published in Spanish in 2 websites and will appear in English on the Historical Materialism website, historicalmaterialism.org, ORG, hopefully next week. We are currently in the process of relaunching the website, which is the cause of the delay, but we will be publishing it as soon as we can. Great. So now we have some time for questions and comments. We're asking comrades to put their questions or comments in the chat, and then they will be read out in Spanish and translated into English, or English and then translated into Spanish. by myself or by Rolando. And I think we can take a few questions or comments and then ask Paul to respond, and then we can take another series. I would ask comrades to be disciplined. So this means to ask or comment in a succinct form, please. Do not make long speeches and try to be as precise as possible in your question if you have a question. Okay, so we already have a first question from Chile, from Pablo Abuform. His question is the following in English. In What is to be Done, Lenin proposes an all-Russia political newspaper as a fundamental vector of the organization of the vanguard of the working class. Today, newspapers or journals or blogs do not seem to occupy that function, and we do not find anywhere a unitary effort of that magnitude. What could you tell us about this idea of the process of unifying the militant sectors, and what kind of initiative could fulfill that organizing function?
Well, that's a good question. And fortunately, I'm not the person to provide the answer. We collectively, as activists around the world, have to tackle that. That is to say, in What is to be Done, Lenin projects the need for a national newspaper to help unify revolutionary forces. Absolutely true. And it can't play that kind of role now in our world. It doesn't. Newspapers don't do that. I mean, there are newspapers that can be useful tools, but they don't have the same impact that they once had. And some of us who've been out selling the revolutionary paper, we've gotten good experience, sometimes frustrating experience. But why should that happen when people can see the paper online and access it online? But then there's such a flood of technologies and different things that that dilutes the impact. So I think that's an excellent question, and there's still a need for that function, that unifying function. It seems to me this Leninist Days conference is one aspect of addressing that, drawing a number of us together from around the world to together wrestle with some of this stuff. But the answers are not things that I can come up with in a few succinct comments now. I think there will need to be a process of comrades in various areas developing the kinds of tools that we need along those lines. I appreciate that question.
Okay, so we have 3 questions already. First is in English from Sunita Saker. Thank you for the talk, Mr. LeBlanc. Your exposition of Lenin's vision includes a very aware, informed membership that participates in revolutionary change and government. To me, it's what Paulo Freire called conscientization. In current capitalist conditions, where people hold 2 or more jobs and are physically and emotionally fatigued at the end of the day, do you see any possibility of this widespread conscientization?
That's a wonderful question that Sakar has asked about, Comrade Sakar has asked about, well, so Lenin is projecting a well-informed membership, but Jesus, and it's similar to Freire, but a lot of people, they don't have the time. They're working various jobs. They're in a terrible situation, so how can you have such widespread consciousness? This is not a new problem. This is a problem that existed in the time of Lenin. He addressed this problem. And he noted that there are different layers in the working class. And the largest layer of the working class didn't have the time, the ability, the literacy to develop the kind of consciousness that was going to be necessary. Then there were some workers who did have that ability and that inclination, and growing a significant layer of workers, but not most of the workers. But among those workers too, they had families, they had other responsibilities. They, wanted to go drinking Friday night or Saturday night. So they were conscious, they were aware, but they weren't in the forefront. which is an even smaller layer. It's a large layer, but a smaller layer of conscious workers. And there's something approximating that now. So to think we're going to have all of the workers all together all the time with a certain level of consciousness, that's not reality. The question can't be shrugged off. It's something that must concern us. So what do we do in order to reach more and more and more people? And again, that has to be a collective process of figuring that out within our own reality. So I think it poses the question well, and the answer needs to be developed by an even larger range of comrades and with more time than we have here. So excellent question. Appreciate it.
We now have a question in Spanish from Carlos Britos.
We're going to be discussing this further and in more depth in our panel on Lenin's socialism, Lenin's conception of socialism on February 1st. So I would urge the comrade and other comrades who are interested in this question to connect with that panel with Thomas, Krausch, and myself, and hopefully others. The state and revolution it's one thing is it's an excavation of the thinking and ideas of Marx and Engels, very thoroughgoing. But it does project what might, I don't know if it's post-conflict or post-political, but it does project at some point there being this amazing society, and one wonders, how can people, as we know them, do what Lenin is projecting? And they can't. It's impossible. It's ridiculous. And psychoanalysis might be part of it. But, everybody's got problems. Maybe we can overcome them. Just because I have problems, psychological problems, doesn't mean that I'm non-functional and can't, work with others in a good way. But I think that in 100 years, let's assume for a moment that that humanity is not destroyed, that we're not driven back into barbarism, that we actually make this goddamn socialist revolution that we're talking about, and not in a single country, but in a number of countries, and we have a shot at creating socialism. It's not going to look like Lenin's highest stage of communism and state and revolution. It's going to be emerging from the realities of our own society. But in 100 years' time, what's the evolution going to be? And that's an interesting question. And we're not going to decide that. It will happen one way or another, and it's future generations that are going to be engaging with this and playing with it. And Lenin gave some of his thoughts of where things might go, but and it may turn out it was naive, totally naive, or it's certainly naive if we want to implement it, sometime soon. So I appreciate the question, and let's continue that discussion on February 1st in our panel discussion.
Okay, so we have a comment and then a question. So a comment is from Marc James Léger. His comment is, the architecture of digital networks mitigates against minority political positions, and so everything is needed in addition to news sources. That's a comment on the previous question about newspapers and so on. And the question is from Luis Guilherme Nobrega Amorim. And the question is the following: in the 21st century, can we have a Leninist party in the traditional mold, or should we try to figure out a Leninism for the post-Soviet era? What do you think about the experiences of broad anti-capitalist parties?
These are such good questions. And I'm just going to focus on the question here from Luis. One needs to ask, well, what is a Leninist party in the traditional mold? What is that? And there are aspects of, Lenin's organizational thought that may not conform to some people's notion of a traditional Leninist or Leninist party in the traditional mold. So one needs to define, well, what is one talking about? But the kinds of things that Lenin was insisting on, I think, still make sense. But the 21st century is different. Our reality is different than it once was in a number of ways. So I think it is the case that we're going to have to find our own way on this to some extent. We can't just, take what happened in the 1930s or the 1920s or 1917, try to superimpose it on our own reality. That won't work. There needs to be a certain creativity and a learning and an experimentation and a collective process in that. That's one thing that occurs to me. On the question of broad anti-capitalist parties, is that the way to go? I don't know. I used to be convinced, yes, of course, that's the way to go. From the standpoint of we've got to rebuild a socialist-minded, socialist-inflected, broad working class movement. And so a number of us have got together to do that. And then within that context, there will be, Bolsheviks who come together, and there will be people who have a different perspective, and things will then have to be fought out and discussed and debated and different tracks and so forth and so on. We can't just do it with a perfect little program with a handful of us, and a bunch of Lenin quotes, so that some broader struggle, I think, makes sense. My hesitation on that is that in a number of cases that has not worked out well. And two of the cases that I can think of are the PT in Brazil, which at one point seemed to me to be that, and Syriza in Greece. And I think some other examples can be found. And the experiences are not all the same, but the experiences have caused me to be skeptical. It hasn't worked out the way I wanted it to, the way that I expected it to. So in Pittsburgh, I am working with activists, some of whom are socialists and some of whom read Marx and some of whom don't, on various things, public transit, Pittsburgh Green New Deal, helping to plug abandoned gas wells, and various projects. There were abortion rights projects, there were workers' rights projects, and so forth. A number of us working together. And out of that, hopefully, there will be a core of socialist activists that will evolve and link up with other such elements in the United States and around the world. So I'm still wrestling with it, and I would look forward to an extended discussion of this with a number of us, comparing our experiences and our thoughts on those experiences. That's about as far as I can go right now.
So we have a question from Julia, who asks, I would like Paul to further develop the distinction between essential and inessential aspects of Lenin's thought. In particular, aren't the historically contingent elements that Lenin and the Bolsheviks had to confront also essential? I mean, a political theory must be able to confront the historical situation without betraying itself. Otherwise, it would be only an abstract ideal.
In Spanish, quisiera pedir que se desarrolle más la distinción entre aspectos esenciales e inesenciales del pensamiento de Lenin. En particular, ¿no son también esenciales los elementos históricos contingentes a los que Lenin y los bolcheviques tuvieron que enfrentarse? Es decir, una teoría política debe ser capaz de enfrentarse a la situación histórica sin traicionarse a sí misma, de lo contrario sería solo un ideal abstracto.
That is a good challenge. So I think there are some things that are clear, and then there are some things that may not be clear. And it depends on one's political point of view. For example, Rosa Luxemburg, and who I love, and she is important to me in multiple ways. Just like Lenin, she's not always right about everything. And I think that for example, on the national question, she was wrong. It's not that she was 100% wrong and didn't know anything about anything. She was very smart and she came up with valuable insights, but that she was wrong on not supporting self-determination for oppressed nationalities, which that was important to Lenin. But it wasn't important to Luxemburg. In fact, she thought it was a dead end. And she might have considered that as non-essential, whereas for Lenin, it was essential. It was an essential part of his orientation. So that's one aspect of the complexity. And there's not a little formula that just solves the problem, but there is a problem and it needs to be addressed. And it seems to me that when she talks about there are essentials and non-essentials, she's onto something there in the Bolshevik orientation. But then how to apply that is a challenge. Let me pause for a minute. Do you want to do a little translation and then I'll finish my thought? Cannot hear. Unmute.
¿Se oye? Sí.
Yeah.
Esto es un reto importante, algunas cosas están claras, otras no tanto, depende del punto de vista político que se adopte. Por ejemplo, Rosa Luxemburgo, como Lenin, también se equivocó. Creo que sobre la cuestión nacional se equivocó, no al 100%, tuvo algunas intuiciones correctas, pero se equivocó al rechazar la autodeterminación de las naciones oprimidas. Lo consideraban un asunto secundario a diferencia de Lenin, ¿no? Y aquí hay un problema importante a la hora de distinguir entre lo esencial y lo que se considera secundario, ¿no?
On the other hand, I think that Luxemburg's critique on the issue of democracy has a validity in part because it's grounded in a shared essential, not only of Luxemburg, but also Marx and also Lenin. And in the situation, and maybe it can certainly be argued, Lenin had to do these terrible things. Well, perhaps, but that's not essential for what he was fighting for. What he was fighting for was something better than a dictatorship by the Communist Party and the Red Terror and various things that were done that Luxemburg felt they were different from what Lenin stood for and what he had been fighting for. It was a swerve away from. It can be understood. She argued, look, the problem is that the Russian Revolution is isolated, and the only way to help the Russian comrades, the Bolshevik comrades, to get over this, get beyond this, is for revolution to spread into Germany and elsewhere. But in any event, it seems to me that that is the commitment to democracy, to a genuine workers' democracy on the part of Lenin and Leninism and Lenin's strategic orientation. That's essential. And the temporary, horrific policies of the Red Terror were not essential. So that partially addresses, I think, what Julia is challenging us on. And again, as with all of these other things, this deserves a lot more discussion. I'm done.
Andrea, you're still muted.
Is that okay? Yes? Can you hear me now? Yeah?
I can hear you.
Por otro lado, creo que Rosa Luxemburg hace críticas sobre la cuestión democrática que son válidas, ¿no? Porque en lo esencial, en la concepción de fondo coincide con Marx y Lenin y cree que lo esencial no es una dictadura de partido y el terror rojo, que tiene un elemento mucho más circunstancial, ¿no? ella entiende la situación, argumenta la importancia de extender la revolución para romper ese aislamiento y esa situación terrible. En cualquier caso, la defensa de la democracia obrera está presente en Lenin, ¿no? Y es un elemento esencial, ¿no? Y hay que distinguir las políticas coyunturales del terror rojo no, como algo, digamos, no esencial en ese contexto tan particularmente difícil, ¿no? Pero eso de nuevo merece un debate más en profundidad.
Okay, thanks, Andre. There's a question from Ernesto de Armas. Can you translate that one, please? You're muted again.
Yes, sorry. Ernesto said, good afternoon. I want to ask one or two questions. Do you think it is possible for a broad revolutionary consciousness to be created among the population in the present, with the media having such great power in an almost uncontested way and using it to set the political agendas that people then aspire to, creating the very aspirations of the working class? How can we break out of this dynamic, or is the media so powerful that it can only be fought in a post-revolutionary scenario?
The challenge of building a broad revolutionary consciousness, of course, is central to all that we have to be doing. It was central to what Lenin had to be doing. The media in Tsarist Russia was not conducive to the message that Lenin and his comrades were attempting to share. They had something going for them, however. My father was a trade union organizer, and he used to say, one of the best organizers for the union is the boss. It's the boss, because he is going to make it clear, the boss is going to make it clear, and capitalism makes it clear, things are lousy. Things are lousy. And if the media is saying, no, they're good, and the boss is a nice guy, a lot of workers, a lot of working class people are going to not accept that. And they're going to see it as bullshit. If things are going badly and the media says, no, things are fine, that is not going to, now that doesn't mean, oh, so we can just wait for people to realize how lousy things are. And people realize how lousy things are to a very large extent. They may not have thought everything through, and some of them may get sucked into something that a right-wing populist demagogue is putting forward. But, and that's an interesting issue. That is to say, the growth of that in part is a reflection of people realizing that things are not going well, things are bad. We have a responsibility and a possibility within that context to engage and interact with people, not only putting forward information that goes against what the media is saying and what the right-wing demagogues are saying, but also helping to organize, and this is key, to organize struggles, actual struggles. Somebody who is somewhat influenced by right-wing media or establishment media may still get involved in a struggle, have contradictory consciousness, but some aspect of his or her consciousness now is going in a working class direction, in a revolutionary direction. So in any event, it's a challenge, a big challenge for us. And what is to be done? How can we break out of this? That is an age-old question. And I've given pieces of an answer, and I would enjoy shooting the breeze with Ernesto and other comrades to go into that more deeply. In a way, it feels to me like...
Sorry, Paul, I must do a translation.
Oh, yes,
It's
yes.
far too long.
I'll add one humorous comment after the translation. Go ahead.
Okay, so el reto de construir una conciencia revolucionaria amplia es central en nuestras tareas, como lo fue en las de Lenin, ¿no? obviamente los medios de prensa en Rusia tampoco eran particularmente favorables a los bolcheviques y a Lenin. Mi padre era sindicalista y decía que uno de los mejores organizadores sindicales es el jefe, ¿no? Porque deja claro que las cosas son terribles y los medios, si insisten en lo contrario, tienden a desacreditarse también, ¿no? Eso no implica que la gente tenga un pensamiento muy desarrollado, ni que el populismo derechista no pueda hacer su demagogia y desorientar. Pero tenemos una tarea de organizar luchas concretas capaces, digamos, de romper el monólogo de los medios del sistema, ¿no? Y en gran medida ese es el reto que hemos planteado, ¿no? Eh, Intentar responder la vieja pregunta de qué hacer, y me gustaría poder reflexionar más, con más calma con Ernesto a este respecto, ¿no?
I was going to add, in a way, maybe you've noticed, some of you comrades have noticed, there is a common element in a lot of my answers. Oh, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. And, I wish we had more time to develop the answer, and then, but there's truth to it too. I'm thinking of Lenin's comments to the Italian comrades, where he's saying, we don't things in Italy are not going to work out exactly the way we did it in Russia. How's it going to be different? You don't know, and neither do I. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. That's an element in what Lenin stood for. This French phrase, some have attributed it to Napoleon, commit yourself and then see, and then see. Commit yourself to the struggle. We've got to commit ourselves to the struggle and then see. And understand that there's a lot to learn from each other, from the experience, from people who aren't part of our movement, workers and others who are not part of our movement yet. It's a collective process that we have to develop.
Still muted,
Sí,
Andre.
quería añadir en tono humorístico, ¿no? Que habréis notado que voy repitiendo varias veces la misma respuesta, ¿no? Que todos son buenas preguntas y repito la necesidad de tiempo para abordar colectivamente las respuestas, ¿no? Y para reflexionar colectivamente, ¿no? Pienso en lo que decía Lenin a los camaradas italianos, ¿no? Ni vosotros ni nosotros sabemos cómo será la revolución futura, ¿no? Y luego también, como se dice en Francia, una frase que se atribuye a Napoleón, ¿no? De que primero nos comprometemos, vamos al combate y luego ya veremos, ¿no? Es decir, que esta debe ser un poco la actitud, ¿no? Y luego, fundamental también, entrar en contacto con trabajadores que todavía no forman parte de nuestro movimiento, ¿no? Para aprender de sus experiencias y sus luchas. I would like to know what you think about the Negri and Guattari proposal in mid-80s to rebuild the communist movement through an articulation of heterogeneous minorities rather than on the base of a universal subject allegedly homogeneous like the proletariat. Do you think that the interesting struggles only can be fought in a revolutionary manner in the way that have been struggled mainly as struggles for um, uh, the will to preserve and to fight authoritarianism internal to queer issues as our own oppression. Lenin referenced in What Is to Be Done the liberty of critique, and he says that the idea is very discussed among socialists and democrats of all the countries. In the current conditions, how can we understand and practice this kind of free critique inside the revolutionary political spectrum? This is the question.
Okay. I may not be able to address all that the comrade Juan is getting at or trying to get at, and I apologize for that. And I will just make a few comments about aspects of the question. There in the 80s, there was a notion put forward and attacked by some as identity politics. And there was an argument that actual struggles, needed to be focused not on working class issues, but on issues of gender, sexuality, race, et cetera, various different identities. And there was a fierce controversy. There was fierce controversy among some people who believed they were defending the Marxist line against that, and attacks on them for being rigid and dogmatic. My thinking is this, and it's consistent with some of what Lenin says, but of course Lenin was living in a different time. So there are some things that may not have been part of his awareness or consciousness or made sense to him, and now we need to sort it out and deal with it. But Lenin, I agree with Lenin and Marx and Luxemburg and others about the centrality of the working class in bringing about the change that is needed. And that I see as the majority class whose lives and labor society and the economy is based on, and that has the potential power to bring about change. I think it would be a mistake to counterpose that to, oh, you're involved in women's liberation or queer liberation or, environmental, that's divisive. We got to focus just on class, on the working class. And that is wrong. I mean, Lenin has a different position. He says we've got to be against all forms of oppression, no matter who is affected. That's got to be part of our orientation. We have to be tribunes of the people, not simply a trade union secretary. So that's one thing. It seems to me that the various identities which involve oppression, that is, the various identities are reflecting oppression. There's consciousness around that. They have a validity. They need to, people involved in one or another struggle around those issues need to be able to push forward that struggle against their own oppression. Those of us who are Marxists need to be supportive of that. We need to see that as part of a larger class struggle. People who are women overwhelmingly are part of the working class. People who are queer overwhelmingly are part of the working class. People who are Black, or other, so-called racial identities, the majority of them are part of the working class. So there needs to be not a counterposition, but a combining of those struggles, it seems to me. This is worth, again, more discussion, and I apologize if I'm missing some of the point that the comrade is making, but this is a process. That today's discussion is part of a larger process that a number of us will be engaging in over the next 4 months and beyond. I'm done.
Hello. Sorry, still got trouble to unmute. Sobre esta cuestión que planteaba el compañero, efectivamente, en los años 80 hubo muchos debates acerca de las llamadas políticas de identidad, ¿no? Relacionadas con cuestiones de género, sexualidad, raza, etcétera. Hubo una controversia muy fuerte. Algunos atacaban estos movimientos desde una supuesta ortodoxia marxista, ¿no? Sin embargo, mi pensamiento tiene que ver con cómo lo enfocaba Lenin, ¿no? De acuerdo con Marx, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburgo, estoy en la centralidad de la clase trabajadora como sujeto potencial de cambio, ¿no? Por el lugar que ocupa en la sociedad capitalista y demás, pero al mismo tiempo creo que es un error contraponer esto y entender como algo divisionista la lucha contra opresiones específicas, ¿no? Y desde este punto de vista, como decía Lenin, ¿no? Debemos ser más bien tribunos del pueblo y no meros sindicalistas economicistas, ¿no? Me parece que las identidades relacionadas con opresiones específicas tienen una validez y merecen que la gente se comprometa en luchar contra dichas opresiones, movimientos autónomos y demás, de mujeres, gays, minorías raciales, que en cualquier caso, en su inmensa mayoría, forman parte de la clase trabajadora de todos modos, ¿no? Y es muy importante no contraponer una cosa a la otra, sino más bien combinar, ¿no? La centralidad de la lucha capital-trabajo y los elementos de lucha contra opresiones específicas. Pero vale la pena, de nuevo, entender este primer debate como un proceso de cara a las próximas sesiones.
Okay, we have two last questions, which we can do quickly. One question from Venezuela. From a socialist perspective, Venezuela's current government is in a bit of a conundrum. While the official discourse is essentially socialist, Maduro's politics is developing a very particular kind of capitalism in which the people at the bottom, the grassroots movements, keep the socialist discourse going, but in practice on the streets, the very same people is on its own, ruled by very liberal market laws in which the US dollar is the master of everything. I would like to know what Paul LeBlanc's take on Venezuelan socialism is. And then there is a question from Carlos. There's a comment or question from Carlos D at 1734, Andreu, in Spanish.
Should I address the one question that we have in English, or should I wait?
Sure, do that briefly, yeah.
Do that briefly. Okay. I have been supportive of struggles for socialism in Venezuela, and which reflected in some of what, not only some of what Hugo Chavez attempted to do, but the mass support in defense of him and in defense of certain of those policies. At the same time, the situation is much more complex, and it's gotten even increasingly complex after the death of Chavez. So I have too much to learn to be able to, say, oh, well, this is what I think. I think it's complex. I think the dynamics that the comrade points to of a government having certain official policies that officially go in a socialist direction, and then on the ground, economic policies that are going in a different direction, that kind of thing has existed in my lifetime. I've seen a number of examples of it. I can understand that there's an argument that something like that is going on in Venezuela, and I would like to learn more. That's as good as it gets for me.
Sí, sobre la cuestión de Venezuela, yo llevo muchos años apoyando las luchas en Venezuela, ya desde los tiempos de Chávez. Sin embargo, es evidente que las cosas han empeorado en los últimos años, en particular desde su muerte, y que se está dando una contradicción creciente entre el discurso oficial del gobierno y la realidad social y política en el país. Pero en cualquier caso, reconozco que necesito más información y conocer mejor la situación para poder aportar a este nivel, ¿no? Sebastian, could you post me back the last interventions in Spanish, please? I can't find them.
It's just one from Carlos.
Carlos.
Yeah.
Carlos,
Here it is. Putting it in the meeting.
Oh, yeah, this is the one on Venezuela, right?
No.
No, after.
It's on Enzo Traverso Engines. En esta misma línea, Enzo
Okay, okay. So in this same line, Enzo Traverso has mentioned in his recent book, on revolution, that movement and insurrection and social insurrections, the most recent ones since the Arab Spring, the Gilets jaunes in France, and the social explosions or mass upsurges in Chile and Colombia, seem to be organized in a radically different manner as from parties and social movements traditionally in the 20th century. Nevertheless, he recognizes the weakness of these movements due to the lack of a structure and militant cohesion, and he calls to rebuild an organizational tradition of Marxism inside these new social movements, forms of organization. So in this framework, which would be the best heritage that we could recuperate from the Leninist set of ideas?
I think I understood everything except that last piece of the question. What would be something about a heritage of the Leninist? What would be the best heritage?
From the Leninist ideas, yeah.
Okay.
In this new framework.
In the context of these new movements and so on, what do you think is the aspect of Lenin that one can save or is still applicable?
Well, there's more than one aspect of Lenin. The things that I presented in my talk, it seems to me, a lot of them are essential. I mean, a certain approach to Marxism and to theory, the interplay of theory and practice, a commitment not just to philosophize about things, but to do something. To engage in actual struggle and be learning from struggle, and involving more and more people, workers and the oppressed, in that scenario of building struggles and learning from that. That's Lenin, and that's important. Being organized, developing cadres or cadres of people who have a capacity and understanding. How do you write a leaflet that makes sense? How do you write a leaflet that can draw people to a meeting? How can the meeting make sense? How can the meeting come up with decisions that make sense? And then how do you implement those decisions and help people implement the decisions? This involves a certain approach to organization that is Leninist. Now, not just Leninist, but these are important aspects of Lenin. There's much, much more. It seems to me and I haven't read Enzo's book on revolution, but what Carlos describes as its content, or the gist of it, makes sense to me. That makes sense to me. And I think that the Leninist heritage and various elements in the Leninist heritage make sense in that process. And that's part of what I'm talking about. I see what I've been presenting today and what we've been discussing today as coinciding with the kinds of things that you're telling me Enzo Traverso says in the book Revolution, which is not surprising to me. I think that large numbers of us are wrestling with this increasingly, and not just older people like myself, but younger activists are wrestling with this and are going to be wrestling with this. That's about as far as I can go right now with my understanding of the question. I think that this Leninist Days set of activities is extremely important. I am so glad that Rolando and Sebastian and other comrades have pulled this together. I see it as part of a larger process that engages with the question that was just asked and the other questions that have been put forward. And we'll see what happens. But I appreciate being part of the discussion, comrades.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. I think we're going to call things to an end now. I wanted to remind people of the recent publication of Paul's book, which is entitled Lenin, Responding to Catastrophe, Forging Revolution, and it's published by Pluto Press. And I don't know whether there are translations in Spanish or other languages which are planned, but they certainly should be. I wanted to call on Rolando maybe to say some words about the next sessions happening imminently, and then of course to thank Paul and all the other comrades for organizing this.
Dice que hay más de un aspecto, muchas de las ideas desarrolladas en mi ponencia son claves, la relación entre teoría y práctica en particular, la participación activa en luchas concretas. Dice en este contexto de construcción de movimiento y aprendiendo de lo nuevo, ¿no? Organizar, formar cuadros, formación práctica, ¿no? Organizar reuniones, como escribir panfletos y octavillas, etcétera, ¿no? Es decir, un enfoque de la organización que son leninistas, pero no solamente leninistas, ¿no? No he leído el libro de Enso sobre revolución, pero por lo que decía Carlos, tiene todo el sentido en términos de herencia leninista, ¿no? No es una sorpresa para mí, muchos abordamos esta cuestión, ¿no? De la relación, tanto los viejos como los jóvenes, ¿no? Creo que estas jornadas son sumamente importantes y agradezco a Rolando, Sebastian y el resto de camaradas el esfuerzo, ¿no? Sobre el libro que acaba de publicar Paul en inglés, se llama Lenin Responding to the Catastrophe, Forging Revolution, que está en Pluto Press, si no me equivoco, que decía Sebastian. Y luego, por traducir la última despedida de Rolando, ¿no? Es decir, agradecimientos nuevo a Paul. Que mandéis también las preguntas que se han quedado en el tintero, nos han podido responder en directo por email, ¿no? Para que pueda responder por escrito Paul. Que la siguiente sesión va a ser el jueves 1, con una mesa que es el socialismo para Lenin, de nuevo con Paul Blanc y Thomas Kraus de Hungría. Y nos vemos el jueves, mejoraremos el aspecto técnico y a pesar de todo hay que felicitarse por seguir siendo 100 personas tras 2 horas de debate.